Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Design Museum. For some of you, this will be your first time here, probably, so welcome. It's a great pleasure to have with us tonight Reinier de Graaf from OMA. It's a pleasure for a number of reasons. One, because he is the architect behind the master plan of this site, which most of you will know. In fact, he probably needs no introduction to most of you. But Reinier is going to talk tonight about that project and this project. But there are other reasons too. He's also, as the director of AMO, the think tank at OMA, participating in our opening exhibition, Fear and Love, with an installation about Brexit. And Reinier, as well as being a very well-known and prolific architect, has also been writing more vocally in the last couple of years and is working on a book which will come out next year about architecture and politics, and we may touch on that later. So there's really a clutch of good reasons to have him here with us tonight, and I'm not going to dwell on the introduction because Reinier is well known, but he'll do a short talk about this project and other things, and then we'll have a brief conversation and hopefully have time to invite you to throw some questions at us afterwards. So without further ado, Reinier, please come up and give him a warm welcome.
Thank you for this very kind and flattering introduction. Thanks to the Design Museum for hosting this event. I have named my talk How We Got There. I would like to speak about the project we did for this site in the broadest possible term, a project which I guess is also at least partially the reason why we're able to congregate in this room today, here tonight. I think it was announced on the website as a conversation with Justin, but the fortunate thing is that I think the talk can also be seen as a 45-minute long question addressed to you, with a question at the end. It's a very unusually, perhaps traditional architect's talk, but since I haven't done one probably in quite a long time, it is perhaps refreshing, if only for me. We are the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. We are an architect's practice. It would be fair to say that we are a bit more, but we've never stopped being also, in addition, a traditional architect's practice. And as a practice, we have projects. We have projects that never become a reality, in fact, the vast majority of them. And then we have projects which do, and then there are certain projects where you don't really know if they became a reality. That goes probably for the vast majority of things that you realize, that they take a very long time. Things change in the course of doing the project, but I'm not sure if that necessarily is a form of failure or whether that makes them any less interesting. I think such is the business of architecture, by and large, how you deal with changes in the process, rather than how much equally as much as how much of your idea you can impose. In 2007, we were approached to look, as it was called at the time, a site in London, a site in Kensington. This was a site with an empty building, the home of the former Commonwealth Institute. It was a listed building, but it was a building which only the year before the government had tried to delist because nobody wanted it, nobody wanted to make use of it, and it was costing a bum of money to the council to essentially retain the building. The building was designed in 1959 by RMGM. It had a typical feature of the time, which was its hyper-paraboloid roof. In the late 50s, early 60s, many of those were designed, far more than were actually realized. And what makes the Commonwealth Institute special is that it was realized here that for the exhibition hall of the Commonwealth, it has helped create a very peculiar inner atmosphere, in addition to being, of course, a structural tour de force. The Commonwealth was founded in the 1950s. It was the successor of the British Empire. Britain, after the war, would no longer be an empire. It would be part of a Commonwealth of equal nations from that moment on. I think and that's interesting in relation to what we're going to talk about. It was even aggressively imagined by the British government as an alternative to the EU. It would be open to other countries. Even the countries of Western Europe were free to join, and in that way they hoped to prevent Germany and France actually founding their union, but it never materialized. It's sort of interesting. A Commonwealth of equal nations. This is the exhibition hall. New Zealand, Australia, Britain, carefully located on prominent places near the entrance. And as you go to more remote places of the building, its nations become purer, and they also become more aggressively oppressed colonies in former lives, I guess. So supposedly an equal congregation of nations, but enough remnants of colonial thinking, I would say, even in the allocation of nations. That was the building as we found it. The building in its entirety was a Grade 2 star listed building, and not only was the building listed, also the various parts of the terrain of the site itself that surrounded the building were listed. The flagpole area in the front, a water feature, and a garden at the back were also part of a registered landscape, which meant they weren't to be touched or messed with in any way, shape or form. So this was the flagpole area, this was the pond, the registered landscape pond, the canopy leading up to the building, and this is the listed Sylvia Crow garden at the back. It's sort of an interesting contrast between the actual state of the building, the state of its parts, and its degree of being sacrosanct in terms of heritage. This garden that was listed, very interestingly, was a garden that was designed but never executed. But the mere fact that something was imagined for this rather dreary site at the back was enough to list it. I think if we would extrapolate that thinking to our own Earth, for probably half the Earth's surface would be a listed site. Anyway, we looked at the site, and we tried to look as long at the site without exclusively looking at the building, without being overly intimidated by its degree of protection. And we looked at the neighborhood. We looked at Kensington. We did a flashback, middle of the 18th century. Actually, London hasn't quite reached the site. The site is an estate. By the middle of the next century, London is about to engulf the site, and the first contours of what we have come to know as Holland Park become visible. This is the middle of the 20th century, with Holland Park as a park actually in Kensington. And then interestingly, the 1960s, with the erection of the Commonwealth, formed the first infringement upon the park that we know. We looked at whether we could give something back. It is interesting to know, we did a long trail of work on this building, and some have said that this building in its current form, this project in its current form, has got more designers per square inch than any other building. Well, be that as it may, I would like to use this. I don't think it's that bad, to be honest, and I would like to use this occasion to mention them. There's Allies and Morrison, our co-architect, who worked with us on the design of what we ended up doing. There's Arup, very important structural engineer, without whom I'm sure this building would have collapsed before it had been able to turn into a museum. There is Westate, a Dutch landscape firm who did the landscape, and finally there is John Paulson, who did the interior of the museum, and then there is us. We imagined that although the landscape was registered, although the building was listed, that we could probably sacrifice certain parts of the building if somehow sacrificing those parts would mean giving something back. So we simply assumed some parts were more listed than others, although they were all equally listed. Imagined the demolition of the service wing, the parking lot besides, and some of the things in front, for actually the site to be engulfed by green, as though it was part of Holland Park, as though the park were restored to its original form. So it's the building, this is the building without its paraphernalia, and preferably we wanted to go further. We wanted to lift the building on stilts so that the park could go freely underneath, engulf the whole building. And in doing that, as said, this is then the building actually as a tent in the park in the 19th century drawing zoomed that I showed earlier. It's interesting that when we started on the project in the first year, we worked without a prospective user for the building, without a prospective user to use this interior. And so we did what we always do when we don't know how to use something. We imagine Prada takes hold of it. But we went further. I mean, speculated on users. We imagined an auction house in the spaces, or a modern, innovative American corporate giant using it as an open plan, or a mixture of all of the above. We did these things, of course, largely to attract attention. In a classical sense, you design something for a user. I guess here we created imagery to attract a user, to in a way create the right amount of talk, that work was being done on the building to get people interested. But it takes a stretch of the imagination for anything like this to happen. This is the interior as we found it, and for very understandable reasons. For a long time, actually the whole history of the building was a series of attempted failures, a series of attempts to bring it back to life, which for various reasons almost consistently failed. The building itself, and much of the rhetoric of the designers at the time talk about its provisionality. They talk about the tent of the park. They describe their own creations in very provisional terms, even to the point that you wonder if they had ever wanted their building to last, let alone become listed. And the provisional nature of the building was very apparent in a number of things. We did an inventory of all the elements that made up the building, which for various reasons had become obsolete. The walls on the floor below, and that little platform, walls, etc., even to the columns on the ground floor, which manifestly would not support loads demanded for a contemporary use today, and certainly not for a museum. The exhibition at the time had been quite a different story than the demands of a museum with potentially heavy pieces. So that's what was left of the interior after an inventory where we really started to check it against functional criteria. So this was the building. After an examination of what was useful, that was the building. And strangely, this image appealed to us in an aesthetic sense. There is something undeniably beautiful about this building, where it's a single space covered by a hyperbolic paraboloid roof, and it can be enjoyed as such. And it's of course also the interior is a kind of tabula rasa for a new beginning. So we imagined the Guggenheim inside, or perhaps a more modern contemporary arts museum inside, even to the point of a rather different scenario where we essentially split down the space exactly across the axis of symmetry, which is diagonal, with this shape of roof. And we would all the functional new stuff on one side, and we would preserve the emptiness on the other side. So it's a big, giant mirror across the diagonal, where actually half of the space would be perceived as the complete space, as you can see it here. It's still one of my favorite ideas, but we never managed to become a majority in terms of appreciating this. Anyway, the emptiness. Another thing we did was simply look very carefully at the facades, look at the structure of the facade, and see if the darkness could be taken away by opening the facade to the park. Again, to have a single free-floating space, kind of one with its surrounding, something like that. We discovered that the size, the footprint of this building is identical to Mises Neue National Gallery in Berlin. Well, at least the roof. The setback of the glass is a bit smaller. But that fits exactly into here. So to some extent, that kind of sacrosanct emptiness, even in terms of size, seems to mimic something. So we put the Neue National Gallery on the inside. Imagine simply inserting one floor supported by two beams running in perpendicular directions, which would keep up the whole thing, like that. Imagining surface on one side, public on the other side, and rotated 90 degrees on the floor above. And that would then look something like this. Two giant, sort of very monumental walls separating the space. Another idea stemming from this is that flat plane, you could of course imagine that you don't put things on top or below it, but that you put things in it. So another thing here was a giant Vierendeel truss with only a few supports to sit inside the building, with various voids and various degrees of being filled in. Something like that, in a way almost a new building inhabiting an old building, like a kind of shell. Something like this, very 60s, in a way contemporary while new, I guess. And the last idea we imagined is that we would do that to a limited extent, that the flat floor would acquire a certain thickness where it could also contain a program. So that's a flat slab running across the whole thing, where you would actually have a third floor in a building that would seem two floors, 2 stories, but an invisible third floor between, where you would have all the utilitarian functions, etc., etc. You would take an escalator from the ground floor to the second floor, always skip the first floor as though it wasn't there, so that in a way there was a downstairs and an upstairs, and the upstairs would be under the roof. We imagined a very shiny floor so that the roof would come down, go into the floor, that you would be in a womb-like space enveloping you. All of that stuff cost money, and we didn't have a user. But one of the obligations of the project, in an era where not a lot of functions are subsidized by the public sector anymore, one of the premises of the project was that in a way one half would work for the other one, so that to some extent development, in this case residential development, had to be imagined on the site. And the site's fairly large, about 157 meters by almost 100 meters in cross-section. Potentially quite a lot of space around the building to put something, but of course all of that space is listed. And here, and that is the big gamble in the dark of the project, here we had to imagine development, and something had to go. Interestingly, this is a modern building. It was listed, but it was the source of controversy at the time. And London has a very interesting relation to modern architecture in that respect. Probably the most interesting controversy that London ever knew was with Mies in the city of London. So why not? We looked at residential development. We put residential development close to Melbury Court, on either side of Melbury Court, leaving large parts of the site empty, in a way imagining one modern building no longer alone, but being accompanied by another modern building, very akin in spirit, at least of the same period. You would look from one modern space onto another modern space, and for a brief while this was an island in London where you could imagine that actually all of London was modern. And you could in a way be unburdened by London's obsessive traditionalism. Anyway, the good thing was that together this is some 35,000 square meters, the Lakeshore Drive Towers. The good thing was we only needed one of them to do the job. That proposed, we realized, well, we more than realized, called active science, that something like that wouldn't probably fly. So imagined a different strategy where in a way the residual parts around the building would be filled by blocks of a progressive size, whatever the size of the site was that they could stand in, almost like Russian dolls, a similar form progressing, and in a way a form which allowed each part of the site to in a way be responsive to its context. A middle-sized building, more or less the size of the street buildings on the street, a somewhat larger building in the middle mimicking the size of a Park Close Towers built from the 60s, 9 stories, and a smaller building towards the back where the building faced the park. Then we did another thing. We rotated all of these buildings so that in a way what had been an exception in London's urban fabric, a 45-degree rotation. We always thought there were some mystical reasons why the designers did that, but it turned out that they didn't want to fell some trees, so they turned the building 45 degrees. But the building was almost a lot better without that story. So we declared it mystical, almost like a mosque, rotated in size, and it got company from 3 other buildings, so that there is a progressive set of 4 squares, 3 of which new, of a progressive size, of which the existing building is the biggest. This is the buildings in the very first iteration. And this is in a way the buildings work in the city. The idea is that the largest one is in the middle, so that a view on the largest building is shielded by 2 smaller buildings on either side in terms of perspective, so that you only ever see one from a large part of view. Also the building recessed from the street. Modern architecture is typically tolerated when it's invisible, so at least we made the largest quantum of the development invisible, we argued. The architecture, we imagined in a way wireframes initially, very 90-degree, almost like a 3-dimensional form of graph paper, contrast to the curvature of the roof, against which the curvature of the roof would register, which in a way as set pieces around the exhibition building would form the building's setting. So very simple buildings, progressive in size, 2 bays, 3 bays, 4 bays, 4 stories, 7 stories, 9 stories, progressing in size. Pure grid, which we actually imagined to be both a structural grid and a mechanical grid, where each column you were looking at, each beam you were looking at, would at the same time be a duct. A system developed with Arup, a series of cross columns linked by I-beams, which were then enveloped in a rectangular hollow section and tied to a vertical circulation and plant rooms, where actually each column, this is the steel and the cross, would actually also house ducts and other mechanical stuff, and then would be boxed in by a section. It was never, the buildings are conventional concrete. This was never built, but this is the structural principle of the Timmerhuis building we built in Rotterdam, which we started later but finished earlier. So the copy precedes the original. There you go, the I-beams, box, units. etc. And in a way, steel building that were then reproduced in vertical. The idea was that the neutrality of the structure would stand in contrast to the amounts of apartment types and homes it would house, so that in a way we imagined a stacking of different modern typologies in this grid, being serviced by this grid, boxed by this grid. The eventual result didn't quite turn out this way, as you've probably seen on your way in, and that was essentially a first iteration where the 3 cubes around the buildings were coupled to their architecture. Now, I think we were about halfway into our fantasies, about half a year into our fantasies, when we got a very interesting email from Chelsfield. Dear Renier and Beth, Beth is a colleague. I met with Dayan Sujits of the Design Museum today. This is the developer's representative. They are very interested in the CI, but whether they can make it work and have the funds is another question. So, I mean, this sort of, I think immediately after, really created serious upward pressure on the amount of residential we had to stuff on the site. But there we go. The Design Museum was interested in taking the challenge of this space, knew the condition, in a way expressed an initial interest in the scenario of the hidden floor, the 3-story museum with a middle floor dedicated to services and a large upper space to enjoy the roof, and a reception space at the bottom. We looked at how to do that. That's a structural grid of the building, a 3-meter grid. We imagined the floors in there with a larger grid, which inside that grid could be filled in with utilitarian spaces, avoid in the middle kind of corridor around servicing them all, and then again large gallery spaces on the top, and here there would only be the structure of the roof. In a way, it's that earlier grid that it sits in, so that in a way the structure on the roof, reminiscent of Mies' Chicago project, would have a hyperbolic paraboloid roof. He had a space frame, the American flag. The expression of the Design Museum is a hyperbolic paraboloid with Helvetica as their religion. So that sums it up, a kind of a reception area on the ground, a service floor with a big void in the middle, and then an open floor at the top, which meant that even from the ground floor on, immediately upon entering, you would see the roof, very important for English heritage, and that while upstairs you would actually enjoy the roof, sometimes because of its particular shape, the roof was very high and very remote, but sometimes very near and very intimate. So that was the Design Museum. We had a user at specific demands, and eventually also the press got wind of it, and things appeared to be going well until first reports, heritage groups dismayed at Koolhaas. I'm very glad it's Koolhaas, isn't it? It's just like this, I can tell you. So Koolhaas encountered dismay, even to the point that a rival scheme was proposed, but it was unclear whether it was at that point, because a lot is operated by rumors. There is, I think, Patrick Schumacher in his talk in Berlin, I won't go into that, but in his talk in Berlin, I think spoke of a poker game with public authorities, and I have to say that is an element I recognize, because it was they had reservations, they needed more comfort, whatever that is, and it was unclear whether they were actually opposing our plans for the building or actually the architecture, and at least what we got back from local residents is that they had some reservations about the architecture. Probably if you look at the image and you see most of the stuff around here, it's clear why. So we were set to pretend to put forward our own rival scheme. Not necessarily better or more varied, but at least of a scale which was smaller, which is always good. And we imagined that in a way the variations, which we had imagined as part of the larger grid, as a container of different form homes, would survive, but in the context of a smaller grid, so that the eventual cubes would almost be a marriage between a first alternative and a second alternative, and that we could tactically use these variations to vary the apartments, create outdoor spaces on the roof, and create also open space on the ground floor, sometimes recessing the facades by 2 or 3 bays, sometimes have the interiors of the housing come out, redirect the view in a way to look back at a building, and sometimes preserve the building in its pure smaller form. Seen from the front, this is the rear building with an opening and terraces to the park. So that became that. 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 Anyway, this was the first time we thought we had produced an image that might be encountered favorably. There was one hurdle. We were convinced, but nevertheless, locals or many of the objectors, which were many and varied by the time, also the objections were many and often contradictory. But we, in a way, looked at what we could do. And the nice thing was that with this relatively more varied, more open-ended aesthetic, we could introduce changes in the cubes, which before we couldn't. Any change before meant an overthrow of the entire minimalist principle. So here we could use those pixels as a kind of tactical instrument, for instance, to create better views of the museum behind, to make a larger, I think this changed back in the final result, but to create larger views on the building behind, create more space on the ground floor. That wasn't enough. There was one last hurdle, and this was in the meantime, summer 2009, where we were asked to essentially scale down the buildings from there to there. I have to say we lost area. And as a result, there was a real endangerment to the financial balance of the whole scheme, but we were very fortunate that the hysterical London property market sort of rectified that on its own. I have to say personally, this change in a way made the building closer to the original cubes of progressive size we had proposed. So it was a negotiation with the council with, in my view, not an altogether bad result. So in that sense, on the results of the poker game, I differ with the previous speaker in Berlin. Anyway, so that's the thing with the floor off. It's a render, pretty close to what it became. And again, the same principle here, taking the floor off allowed us that from the park, from the steps of Holland House, a building, the middle building, which was very present, would in a way recede behind the roof line of the building in front. So therefore that became that, and that became that, and then English Heritage backed Hermès revamp. So there we go. Demolition work. I make a jump in time of the whole thing. An enormous site, also a new basement for the museum, a car park, in a way. The project of 3 cubes keeping a 4th building company was of course made very, very complex by the fact that a lot of stuff buildings need, parking, services, basements, etc., were all suppressed in a basement underground. The landscape you see is essentially a landscape roof of an underground building. So it was very clear that when site work started that this was a massively complicated, all-encompassing effort, where, given the new basement, the whole existing building had to be temporarily propped, kept up in the air for works to start underneath. Here you see some of the propping. Even taking floors out and building the basement meant that the ground, which in a way had been a counterforce to keep the columns, the diagonal columns that keep the roof in place, had to be suspended in the air, and of course could no longer perform that role, which meant that artificially the building had to be held together by a force of 600 tons, the equivalent of two, what is that, A380s? Yeah, the equivalent of two A380s pulling full force on either column in, so that is that. It's a temporary structure which actually keeps the roof in the air. The columns were cut off because we reused them for the new facade, but they no longer had floors to be attached on, which meant that at some point in this exercise, this building was literally a hovering, flying saucers on the site, and had we wanted to, we could have moved it 10 meters to the left or to the right or wherever. I think would have been an interesting first in heritage terms. I think they tried something on the Farnsworth House like that, moving it to a different location, but anyway, this was for me the highlight of the whole project. It's something that should never have been finished, probably, but it was. A new facade was imagined around the building, partially transparent, partially opaque to shield the nearby residence buildings from glare. A complex layered system of the structural work of the concrete, mullions, glass and outer frames of various thickness, all with the idea to create a varied facade. Sometimes that facade is completely closed, sometimes it's completely open, completely glazed, and sometimes it is simply a window in an otherwise closed facade. But from the outside, it has the same continuous appearance as the facade it replaced. Here is a mock-up of the thing. You can clearly see when it is a mock-up and flying in the air, the transparent and the opaque parts. And that was put on the existing structure, then clad with mullions. Here you see, which is quite interesting, the structure of the existing buildings behind with cross bracing for moments, and from the inside. So opaque and green from the outside, but rather transparent from the inside. Meanwhile, the blocks were going up in here, essentially clad. Interesting, very, very large uninterrupted windows, keeping also the idea of a large and a small grid intact with very little additional, without an additional transom, with ventilation, and part of these are shadow boxes, part are also clear glass, but with ventilation invariably organized via the edge of the window, almost like a ventilating window frame, allowing, you see it, allowing the essential panes to remain abstract. You see the buildings coming up, the grids registering against the curvature of the roof. Here's the roof itself. Meanwhile, the floors in the building, according to a layout designed by Paulson, who had in a way inherited our idea of a central void and the extra floors. See that? New columns, new floors, completely new interior. A rendering of how it would look like in the end. Reality looking very, very close to the renderings. I never know whether that's a good or bad thing, but let's assume it at least reflects a building that was built the way it is intended. The opening night, the exhibition Fear and Love by Justin, and our entry to it. What we have designed for this living room is a living room with blinds which reflect the colors of our own designed European flag some 10 years ago, and at the same time the living room is a room of 28 different objects, each from a European country, in a way demonstrating how regardless, one of the drapes is on the floor. Regardless whether Britain exits or not, demonstrating the degree of integration that de facto exists, specifically in the realm of design. So even if that's no longer there, that living room will always reflect a form of European integration. So the blinds can be open or closed. Behind the blinds there is a view of the city, which is Rotterdam in 1940, before there was a European Union, and the blinds can go open and close, and the British one falling down is the only one where you catch a glimpse of all the awful things that could happen if more blinds were to fall on the floor. So that brings me to a kind of conclusion of the talk. We had this barcode designed in 2001, gradually extended with new member states. Currently we have a blind fallen on the floor, but that also means that to some extent, in the same way Britain has left Europe, that Europe has also left Britain. And I simply, it's very early days to say what that means. But one thing it would concretely mean, if this system were to be taken to its ultimate conclusion, probably there would be one half of this project. Maybe then that project wouldn't have existed in the way it has existed, and in a way John Pawson's Design Museum in a way would not have existed in the same way either. So in terms of recent events, my opening question is the same as my lecture title, only this time with a question mark to you. Thank you. Should we do a sort of more uplifting image as a background?
Yes, let's do.
So, hello? I wanted to do the barcode with Britain. No, well, I wanted the barcode with Britain, but there's very little appetite for that apparently. Like, no, I'm trying to, but I can't. Doesn't matter. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Reinier. That was, as ever, fascinating to listen to. There are a number of threads I'd like to pick up on, and then we can bring the audience in too. I think, one of the great things about you is your candidness, and I think listening to you open the talk with, in a way, the idea that architecture is always dabbling in failure, that failure is always kind of around the corner, and that a project is, you never really know whether a project is finished or not. It was interesting to watch you talk through your thinking behind what to do with this building, and even what to do with it when it was clear that it was going to become the Design Museum, because it felt to me like, first of all, it was interesting to see how OMA plays with a building, the way you could kind of throw different ideas in that void and experiment. But it also felt strangely like you were pitching for it all over again. What would you have actually done differently? Which of those schemes do you think would have actually worked in the final instance?
Well, clearly, given what's here now, nothing would have worked. That's very apparent. Maybe a different user would have worked, but I don't think you can't, on the one hand, produce schemes and imagery to attract users and then complain when those users, once you got them, have wishes and demands. In any project, and this just doesn't go for this project. Any project, in the end, is a percentage of everything you intended. You start every project with about 200-300% of intentions, and you end up with less. And many projects, in terms of realization, are a neck and neck race between things you want to see happen, things you want to resist, and anything that's above the 50% mark, in a way, is something you boast about. Anything that's below the 50% mark, you carefully conceal. You hope that it's in a remote enough location that you can do that. But the amount we've talked about this, I think, is indicative of how happy we are with the result. I mean, also the extent to which we have imposed ourselves, even onto your opening, is indicative of our enthusiasm for the project.
I mean, I think you've written about this very compellingly in recent pieces, the relationship of architecture to capital and to capitalism, and to, in a way, the role of the developer in the 21st century city. And this site exemplifies that relationship in some ways. It certainly exemplifies 21st century London. And there are people out there who are unhappy about that. I mean, there are the heritage lobbies, there are even the odd kind of architecture critic that just can't let go of the fact that somehow the Commonwealth Institute once represented it represented many things, but it is of a period in which social democracy was alive and well, and now somehow the site has been desanctified and a developer has moved in, and that creates discomfort for certain critics who are always going to be unhappy at the words luxury development, whatever one does, in spite of the fact that one gives a museum back in exchange. And there's been some kind of, it's been interesting because there's been some kind of breastbeating nostalgia, despite the pictures you showed of what was the reality on the ground with these gardens and these kind of loggias and things. How do you take criticism as an architect, and how valid do you think those things are?
Well, not very well. But I mean, there's little you can do. But of course, criticism, certain well-informed criticism, certain sharp criticism, particularly the criticism that you secretly agree with but you can't publicly admit, is criticism that you take to heart. But I think, on the whole, we can compare what is to what was. I don't know how much sense that makes. I think it is essential to compare what is with what could have been. Had this project not happened and the building would have just carried on existing the way it did, irrespective of its listed status, it would have collapsed. It was close in many ways there. So then you have a collapsed ruin, then you have a building site which is a virgin site because you don't have to delist it anymore because it falls apart, and then probably a very different development altogether would have happened. What I think, talking about social democracy, the project enabled a museum to exist free of charge, that doesn't charge an entrance fee. In Denmark, the Netherlands, all countries that linger in we never had a Thatcher, but we have museums with entrance fees, and they go up and up and up and up and up. And even a respectable social democracy like the Netherlands doesn't live up to that reputation. Here, interestingly, in post-Thatcherite London, you have a museum free of charge. That is a fact, and that is a pretty social democratic feature. So,
I agree.
Nothing to do with architecture, unfortunately, but...
and I also think that one forgets that there are similar models in London. The Barbican Arts Centre, for example, is embedded in what is basically now a luxury development, and was never exactly, socially utopian. It was housing in the City of London. But I think we should pick up on this last point that you end with, the Brexit installation, because actually when we started talking about Fear and Love and how you might contribute an installation to it, we started with a very different idea, and we were trying to...
what did we start with?
We started talking about how we might play off this tension between the houses and the museum, and do an installation, in fact, in one of the apartments. and we were talking about the smart home.
Yeah.
And how, because this is something that has kind of been a theme within AMO's research recently, the idea that the domestic life is changing because of smart technology, and that this is a source of kind of potential anxiety. It seemed like a really suitable topic.
I remember now.
Do you remember? It was very kind of...
Yeah, I remember.
It was a nascent thing.
I also remember elements of that idea which we probably never communicated to you. The idea was that we would have a screen as part of the exhibition, and the screen would have a live connection to an apartment which was for rent, I think at about $1 million a year, and we would do cameras in every room. We would have Airbnb pay for it as a form of marketing, and it would be in and amongst all the uber wealthy other residents. It would be a refugee home for people no longer welcome in Britain because of Brexit. And they could continue to live there, provided they signed an agreement that they were filmed in a Big Brother situation 24 hours a day, and that their fate, and also the reaction of their rich neighbors to them, would be filmed, and that would become part of a documentary. It's true. When that happened, I think shortly before we wanted to implement it, I think the apartment got rented for that amount of money, not to Airbnb, and the whole thing. Airbnb was also, I mean, in typically American way, that is very, very controversial. So that was out of the window. So it was, yeah. I mean, I guess the installation is another instance where, you know, things you intend happen in a different way.
Yeah, no, I think what's interesting about it is that we started with something very dystopian. And in fact, the Brexit thing came in later. But we started with a purely kind of dystopian smart home environment idea. And I think secretly we both knew that this was never going to happen anyway, because of the realities of developers and so on. And then Brexit happened, and we went from a very dystopian proposition to a very idealistic, to a kind of semi-utopian position, which was you, as a practice in a way, putting a position forward in support of Europe in a country that was, you know, very divided on the topic. And it actually didn't occur to me, living in our kind of London metropolitan elite bubble, it didn't occur to me that the installation would actually be, I knew it would be a talking point, but I didn't actually think about people who voted for Brexit coming and seeing that installation. And it was interesting when I gave a tour of the exhibition to a Daily Mail critic, who of course hated the show. His response to that was, this living room shows that European cultures don't belong together. It shows that if you bring something from every country in Europe, you get a kind of bad living room or something. That was his response.
Well, I mean, bad living rooms are an ultimate pan-European feature anyway, so both in and out of context. Well, yeah. Well, it's very interesting that, you know, whatever you put forward, and maybe this is something of this day and age, whatever you put forward tends to embellish either sides of the spectrum. You know, people look at this and they feel all the more, it's a good thing we exited, God. And then other people say, so it's just, I mean, any statement about anything tends to polarize these days.
Do you, I mean, you've started writing more recently. I'll kind of make this a final question, perhaps. And you write very critically and candidly and often very entertainingly. And you're working on a book. What is it that you... Where are you going with this? Do you have things you want to get off your chest, or do you feel like it's more important for you now to have a voice as a kind of critic and architect?
But the book is about the complex nature of a simple profession. And I think, strangely, and I think this is, of course, we have an incredibly obsessive, myopic profession, and I include ourselves, you know, every bit as much in that analysis, who is in a way blissfully unaware of what is their greatest asset. I mean, and they see this as a disadvantage. As an architect, your fundamental dilemma is that you have to change loyalties all the time. You have changing loyalties to different clients. Nevertheless, there is a world which expects you to leave a very coherent body of work. And in my view, the very coherence is in that ever change. That since there are these changing loyalties, since you are very intimately exposed to the mechanisms of power, very intimately exposed to mutual dependencies. This project is a wonderful example of you know, a ménage à trois, with a council that can't do without the private sector and the private sector that can't do without a cultural institution. And remove either of those, a thing like that doesn't happen. So a project like that, as much as it is a physical result, it also becomes a story. And I think those are probably stories only architects who've really lived it from within can reveal with a certain amount of honesty if they endeavor to do that. And I think in many ways probably architecture would benefit from a kind of temporary freezing of an accession of form, style and signature, and not do any of that, and simply, you know, look around, assess the context, see how it has changed, see how certain ideologies that were valid in one time, which were still dogmatically, ruthlessly practiced, actually serve a completely different purpose. I mean, modern architecture is an example. Modern architecture is based on the premise of the economy of means. When you build something cheaply, you can sell it cheaply, or you can rent it cheaply. The fact that you apply an economy of means, you do it to make it accessible to the largest group of people. The economy of means of architecture currently serves a completely different purpose. It serves profit maximization, and as this project would have done had it not been that it had been held hostage by the presence of a cultural institution which consumed a fair share of that profit and gave something back. And that's a very complex story, you know, and to very also a story hard to defend in the face of unilateral criticism, but it's a true story and it's an interesting story.
Well, I look forward to reading it. I don't want to hog your attention because we've got a lot of people in the room here, and I'm sure some of you have some questions or comments. We do have a roving microphone, so do wait for it to reach you, but just raise your hand if you'd like to ask something. Don't be shy. We have a question at the front here.
I just wanted to ask two very basic questions. Who was the original actual client?
Of us? Chelsfield Properties.
Right.
Together with the Ilchester Estate, who owns the land, who had acquired the land and who approached us.
And the additional buildings that were constructed, who are the occupants? Is it entirely residential? Or?
It's entirely residential, with the exception of the front building, which has a store for the Design Museum. And I think, interestingly, on the website of the Design Museum, or when you Google the Design Museum, it's the only building you see, as though that in its entirety is a design museum, which makes me very happy. But yeah, it's mostly residential.
Because that is very striking. You know, the museum is the centrepiece of the site. I mean, the other buildings in their bulk are considerable, but they somehow don't detract from the vision people get coming off the high street. So rather curious, an optical experience, I think.
Well, I think that is the beauty of making them diamonds rather than squares.
The kind of thing is that we had them aligned to the urban fabric, and then it just looks like you're continuing the urban fabric. But by aligning them, the front building in a way becomes an early announcement of the ensemble as a whole, of which the museum is in the middle. It's still, I think the rooftop is still the highest peak of the whole thing, and I think the footprint is still the largest. So the buildings, although considerable in size, and I have to say, throughout the project they grew. And it was a real beast to keep in check proportionally, but I still think they serve as a frame for the set piece in the middle. And even if the museum is no longer itself on the street, it's at least blatantly in the middle of the development.
There's one thing, we have a question here, up there. One thing I quite like about the apartment blocks is that for luxury housing, they're not obsequious. You know, they're not sucking up to the potential residents. There's something almost impolite about them that I feel only OMA could get away with. Do you know what I mean? They're elegant? No. You just... In that case, let's go to the next question.
I think there's something very unique about the architect as a figure, architecture as a methodology of working, which is it's extremely optimistic. I mean, you can be given, like, the client comes and says, we have no budget, we have a terrible site, can you do something good? And you're like, yeah, you know what, I'm going to take these terrible conditions and make something that is an intrinsic improvement. And I think that's clear from what it is you've presented this evening. But in a way, I want to flip the question that you asked, which is, you know, if this explains where we've come or how we've arrived here, where is it that we're going next? And in a way, what role can the architect play at a time in which there are decreasing numbers of opportunities and decreasing level of optimism?
I find it very difficult to answer that question. I mean, I think partially, I think architecture over the past has suffered from exactly that what you're describing, the kind of moral urge to be a guide, an avant-garde that shows mankind the way. I think the whole notion of architecture as an avant-garde is very, very passé. Not only because real innovations, and I'm not just talking technological innovations, but innovations across the board, now happen in other domains. I mean, if the late 19th century saw a number of revolutionary technologies, which in a way allowed us to build differently, faster, bigger, allowed us to project massive infrastructures, then architecture had a certain position because they were innovations that so clearly affected its domain that with some authority they could posture to give that answer. I think that is currently not the case. If you look at the digital technology, it doesn't so much change form, it changes the way we use form. It even makes redundant forms, or forms which we consider historic and over, newly relevant. It's a strange thing that if you look at my city, Amsterdam, that the newest part is the oldest part, that the most modern part is actually the oldest center of the city. So I think there is a weird kind of foresight embedded in hindsight. That it's from a weird kind of reversal that I think somehow, and that's why the question, how do we get here, is important, because maybe the seed for the new is nothing but the well-forgotten old, in a certain way. But I've always been very hesitant of giving, a 10-point plan. Let's privatize Hyde Park, privatize oxygen, etc., etc. So it's not going to come from me. Also, will not lead to a headline in the Evening Standard, but such is life.
Do we have any final questions? Two. I think we'll make these the last two because we have to.
Sorry, just a quick question. I was just wondering how John Pawson came into the project. At what stage did his design come in, and on what areas did you collaborate? Were there any parts that you did together? I was interested in how architects actually collaborate across practices.
Well, since the Design Museum is partially funded by public money, it had to organize a tender for the interior of the museum, which I think it did in 2010, in which we, and since that was the case anyway, we did not participate in that tender, also not to have an unfair competitive advantage in terms of doing the rest of the site. And that tender was organized after planning permission had been granted by the council. We had made it, the designs I showed were in a way designs which were put in for planning so that the English Heritage and the council would have some idea how much we would mess with the building. So the whole room for maneuver was in a way secured by, in a way, our somewhat outrageous proposals at the time. I mean, some of the more outrageous proposals also serve the purpose that when you propose something moderate afterwards, it's seen as a massive compromise. Interestingly. That's the shock value of radical proposals. But in a way, the core and shell, the facade and the framework was so clearly defined, even legally defined, that John Pawson inherited it, made it its own, but not that much collaboration was necessary because the framework was already clear, which is also actually a very nice way of working together.
And we have one final question here.
Hello, my question is to you, Justin. I'm just wondering, when you got involved in the project, and was there room within that for you to make your mark, and did you have any ideas of how you wanted the space to work curatorially?
No, I mean, this was all decided long before I joined the museum, actually, because it's been the project has been in development for a number of years, as Renier just hinted. So, I mean, I only joined the museum a year and a half ago, and I was brought in to do the programming of the exhibitions. So in a way I inherited a fait accompli, 2 temporary galleries, one of them 900 square meters, the other one about half the size, and a 600 square meter gallery on the top floor, which is not a million miles from what you were proposing at some stage of an open gallery just under the roof, which is the permanent collection display and is the free offering that the museum can now make. So no, I mean, in a way, Renier and OMA and John Pawson did phase 1 of the hard work, and phase 2, which falls partly to me, is to make this building a destination.
Would you change any of it if you had the opportunity?
Of course not. No, it's perfect. I'd like to thank Renier. He's, as ever, a very surprising and engaging speaker. So please give him a warm hand.